Now is an opportune time to return to our toolbox. Remember, one of our projects in this class is to develop a box of tools that we can use to analyze the myths when we run into something interesting. We've already talked about structuralism and how it's useful in decoding some of the things we see inside of myths. We've talked about functionalism and talked about how it works as a tool. After having a look at Hesiod, it makes a lot of sense to introduce the tools given to us by the great towering figure in the human sciences, Sigmund Freud. His dates are 1856 to 1939. Freud made many contributions, not least creating the whole field of psychoanalysis, but he's important in the interpretation of literature and across the humanities, not so much in the social sciences anymore. Interesting, psychology has moved on, but he's definitely left a mark on the humanities, and that's surely true for those of us that are interested in myths. Freud has an important set of observations that help us understand myths. We'll work through them, but let's just summarize what Freud's main message is, at least for our purposes, in this class. Freud tells us that myths dramatize events in every individual's mental or psychological development. Myths dramatize events in every individual's mental or psychological development. Now, we're used to having people in our collection of tools and approaches to myth, looking at structuralism and functionalism, and even going back to allegory. We're used to having people tell us that, yeah, myths contain hidden messages. Our ancient allegorists thought that. Structuralists think they contain hidden messages about the structure of the human mind. A functionalist thinks that they contain messages about the values that a culture wants to legitimize to itself. Freud thinks that the hidden messages inside a myth are always going to be about just you and me as individuals developing, working our way through the developing of our psychological state. Now, as a doctor, Freud is interested in any of us as a patient. Now, when a patient goes to see a doctor, the doctor doesn't interview the patient to talk about your national background, your cultural ethnicity, and these kind of things, unless there's something very relevant that happens in those little aspects. Mostly what a doctor is interested in is you as a member of a species, as a universal creature that needs some help. Freud thinks about all of us as universal creatures, and he thinks about the human psyche as a universal organ that all of us have inside of us, and it goes through a developmental process. So looking at a young one and one transitioning from adolescence to adulthood and one transitioning from adulthood into very old age, there is a kind of ongoing, consistent development that Freud is trying to develop a science of. Now, there are many different aspects to Freud. There are many ways that he looks at this psyche. In some of his later periods, some will recognize terms like ego, id, and superego. We're going to look at an earlier version of Freud's idea of the psyche, which has two parts to it. This is one that shows up in the interpretation of dreams in 1900. Now, in the interpretation of dreams, there are many observations that are important. The structure of the psyche that he's working with here is one that's made up of two main parts with a repression barrier in between. We have the unconscious mind and the conscious mind, and the repression barrier in healthy people keeps the unconscious mind repressed. Now, for some people, particularly in America, the idea of repression is a bad thing. It's thought that we should all just be kind of letting whatever desires we have leak out all over the place. Well, Freud thinks that would be a disaster. If the repression barrier weren't there, we would all answer to these deep, dark, unconscious desires that we have. Now, they're very powerful. Some of them can be benign, but some of them can be very toxic and antisocial. All of us, Freud says, at our guts, at our core, have the desire for the most intense pleasures we can, and we'll pursue those deeply selfishly according to the most antisocial, kind of uncivilized behavior as we possibly could if our unconscious was given free rein. If there was no such thing as a repression barrier, all of us would be running around trying to gratify our deepest urges for the most intense pleasure we could find. Now, where is this most intense pleasure going to be found? Freud makes the argument that sex is a very important piece of this. Who could deny that such a thing is true? Freud also talks about food and the pleasures that come from making sure that the organism maintains its metabolizing at a very elemental level. Freud also talks about the pleasures that come from being dominant over others in a group, and that these are the things that are animating our unconscious desires, and luckily our repression barrier keeps them, for the most part, in check. Now, when we think about our psychological houses, most of us think that our conscious desires are the things that we answer to most. We're familiar with these, and sure, we might have some unconscious desires, but they don't really seem all that important. On occasion, some urge will bubble up, but we'll talk ourselves out of it and get on with our lives. Now, Freud says that actually that position should be reversed. The conscious desires that we have are kind of like the tip of an iceberg. Underneath is the biggest part of the iceberg. These unconscious desires are the very powerful drivers that are the energy that presses our life forward. Now, what makes up these unconscious desires? When we meet them, we're going to be a little bit horrified. According to Freud, we want to have sexual pleasure with anything and anyone. That's what we look for in our view of the world, this most intense gratification through sexual pleasure of anything and anyone. Now, that includes even parts of the larger grouping of human beings that you and I run into that are not allowed to us, that are forbidden to us. We want to even have sex with those with whom it's forbidden. And in fact, the forbiddenness makes a kind of forbidden fruit of these potential sexual partners for us and produces frustration that we're forbidden from it, so even amps up the desire even more. And in fact, the one person that you and I are forbidden from having sex with is a parent. Yes, indeed. Freud says we all have an unconscious desire to have sex with one of our parents. We also have an unconscious desire to eliminate the parent of the same gender as us, such that that person is not in the way of us gratifying our sexual desires for the parent of the opposite sex. This is what Freud says. All of us then, in addition to this urge to have sexual gratification through this intense pleasure, also are gratifying an urge to be dominant by pressing the parent that has such a powerful role in our lives aside, the one of the same gender, and having a close, intimate relationship, one that's forbidden, with the one of the different gender. These powerful unconscious desires, Freud says, are present in all of us. Now, luckily, there's a repression barrier, right? Otherwise, such things would go around being gratified, and that would be a bad thing. What Freud says in healthy people happens is that these powerful, even forbidden desires are kept down by the repression barrier. But on occasion, these unconscious desires grow, and they become huge, and they place pressure on the repression barrier. Now, in an unhealthy psyche, the repression barrier has no gaps, and the pressure could cause the whole psyche to explode and no longer work. In a healthy psyche, what happens is the repression barrier opens up on occasion and allows one of these unconscious desires to actually show itself to the conscious mind and allow itself to be gratified. Now, lest you think that Freud thought that on occasion each of us goes around and does those things that he said live beneath the repression barrier, that's not what happens. Instead, what happens is this repression barrier allows the unconscious desire to enter into the conscious mind, but not before it changes it. Through these processes of condensation and displacement, the desires that we feel for forbidden objects, for example, becoming dominant over our own fathers, and perhaps trying to have sexual relationships with the parent of the same, of the opposite gender, these desires are allowed to be expressed, but they're changed. They're displaced and put onto someone else who's authorized. So we could have a dream about dominance over someone else who stands as a symbol for our father, or intimacy with someone else who stands as a symbol or a replacement for a mother. It's a system that Freud says allows this sort of tea kettle of the unconscious mind to let off some steam without having anything that is absolutely forbidden by the conscious mind to happen. Now, getting back to our main story, what Freud says happens here is that in the healthy mind, the unconscious does indeed allow itself to express these desires. And in the interpretation of dreams, he says that a main avenue by which these unconscious desires are expressed is through dreams. Now, to get back to our story in the course, how do myths fit in? Freud tells us, as he extends his thoughts on myths, as his thinking develops in the interpretation of dreams and in later works, says that precisely myths are the dreams of an entire culture. Myths are the dreams of an entire culture. So what we get when we take a look at myths is we get this kind of displaced and condensed expression of primal desires in a culture that are displaced onto now more acceptable targets for those desires. So the desire to overcome the father, all of us get to live it out vicariously via looking at it through this awful figure of Kronos, who we can scold and wag our finger at, but actually each of us gets to live a vicarious thrill by watching a father figure get castrated. The special intimacy and closeness that Kronos has with his mother, there's no sexual relationship that's talked about, but they have a special closeness. This lets us all kind of have a special extra intimacy with mother figures in our life vicariously, but we now live it out through Kronos. The connection here, according to Freud, is that all of us have these desires. These desires have a chance to get themselves worked out through this apparatus. The apparatus, though, you hope works in a special way and modifies, but does not allow the desire to express itself straight up and clearly. Through this modification, then, each of us is engaged always in a process of myth-making through our dreams, and our cultures are, in a way, dreaming as they write their myths. These myths then, according to Freud, are interpretable according to his large scheme, and we see a system, a giant system, in which not only is it true that as humans that are living along, thinking that we have this very well set up conscious mind with a repression barrier that is keeping down our dark desires, all of us are actually living in a psychological house over which we are not quite masters. None of us are quite masters of our own psychological desires. Similarly, in our culture's myths, our culture is not the master over its own cultural product. Instead, what we do through myth is live out all the things that a culture forbids itself. So keep an eye on those things in myth that seem especially salacious, nasty, overstepping of lines, overstepping of bounds. Freud gives us a really interesting tool that's helpful in trying to figure out why in the world would a culture want to tell itself a myth like this.